Europe is supposed to be the responsible one. While America prints trillions and developing nations lurch from one default to the next, Europe holds up its fiscal rules like a badge of honor. Countries are legally required to keep deficits below 3% of GDP. Debt is supposed to stay under 60% of the economy. The oversight is serious. The rules are enshrined in treaty. And yet, beneath the carefully reported numbers, Europe is sitting on a debt crisis larger than anything that appears in any official document. Larger, in fact, than most citizens have any idea exists. That's not a metaphor. That's a measurement problem, one that governments across the continent have every incentive to keep unresolved. Welcome to Untold Financial History, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how Europe built a debt bomb it refuses to officially acknowledge, we need to go back 800 years to a cluster of medieval Italian city-states where the modern concept of public debt was invented and where the template for hiding it was first perfected. In 1262, the city of Venice was in crisis. It had been fighting Genoa for control of Mediterranean trade routes, and the war was draining the treasury faster than tax collectors could refill it. The Venetian Senate faced a choice that would reshape European finance for the next 8 centuries. Raise taxes high enough to fund the war immediately, or borrow the money now and spread the cost across future generations. They chose to borrow. But they did it in a way that had never been tried before at this scale. The Venetian government created something called the Monte Vecchio, literally, the Old Mountain. Every citizen with assets above a certain threshold was forced to lend money to the Republic. In return, they received a certificate, a government bond, paying 5% interest annually, funded by dedicated tax revenues. The certificates could be bought and sold. They could be inherited. They could be used as collateral. The Republic didn't need to repay the principal. It only needed to keep paying interest. It was the birth of the rolling perpetual debt, a system designed never to be repaid, only managed forever. Within a generation, Florence copied it. Genoa copied it. Milan copied it. Within a century, every major Italian city-state had its own version. The interest payments were funded by special taxes on salt, grain, wine, and trade. Taxes that fell hardest on the common laborer, while the certificates themselves were held almost exclusively by wealthy merchants and institutions. The pattern was already established in the 1200s, and it has never truly changed. Public debt is issued to fund state power, managed through rolling refinancing, sustained by taxes on ordinary people, and profitable primarily for those wealthy enough to own the instruments. Every century since has been a variation on this same theme. But the Italian city-states understood something crucial that modern governments conveniently ignore. The moment you stop paying interest, the entire system collapses. In 1345, the House of Bardi and the House of Peruzzi, the two dominant banking dynasties of Florence, collapsed simultaneously when King Edward III of England defaulted on loans worth roughly 1/3 of Florence's annual economic output. The shock rippled through every city-state. Credit froze. Merchants couldn't fund trade. Governments that had borrowed heavily found their lenders suddenly unwilling to roll over existing debts. The crisis lasted decades. It eventually resolved. The debt management system was rebuilt, but the real lesson was buried under the recovery. The machinery of perpetual debt is stable only as long as creditors believe it will never actually be challenged. And here is where the story gets darker. Fast forward 3 centuries to the Spanish Empire, arguably the most powerful state on earth in 1544. controlling vast swaths of the Americas, the Netherlands, Sicily, and large portions of the Italian peninsula. King Philip II inherited the most profitable empire in history, sustained by rivers of silver pouring in from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas. And Philip declared bankruptcy 4 times. Not once, 4 times. In 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. This is the part that rewrites the story most people tell about sovereign debt. Philip didn't go bankrupt because he spent recklessly on luxury. He went bankrupt because he inherited a debt machine that was structurally impossible to repay. His predecessor, Charles V, had financed decades of wars in France, Germany, and North Africa by borrowing from Augsburg banking houses, primarily the Fugger family, at interest rates between 10 and 14% annually. By the time Philip took the throne, nearly 70% of crown revenues were already committed to debt service before a single coin was spent on governance. Think about that, 70%. Before Philip could pay a soldier, build a road, or fund a court, 7 of every 10 coins coming in were already owed to creditors. When Philip defaulted, he didn't actually eliminate the debt. He converted it, forcing creditors to accept lower interest rates on restructured bonds called juros, the Spanish equivalent of the Italian monte. The creditors had no real choice. Accept a haircut or hold worthless paper. Most accepted the restructuring, and then, within a few years, lending resumed. Because as long as the empire's silver mines kept producing, creditors believed Spain's obligations were ultimately sustainable. The debt wasn't solved. It was restructured into something that appeared manageable, until the next war demanded more borrowing and the whole cycle reset. The empire survived 4 defaults, but each one left the underlying machinery a little more fragile than before. Sound familiar? Think about Italy today. Official government debt stands at roughly 144% of GDP, the second highest ratio in the Eurozone after Greece. This number is alarming by any standard, but it's actually not the figure that keeps European economists awake at night. What keeps them awake is what isn't in that figure. Italy's local and regional governments borrowed extensively through instruments that don't always surface in the national debt calculation. Italian municipalities entered into interest rate swap agreements, complex financial contracts, throughout the early 2000s and 2010s that transferred immediate risk off balance sheet while creating long-term liabilities that only become visible when the contracts mature. Estimates of Italy's total public sector obligations, including these derivatives and off-balance sheet commitments, run substantially higher than the headline number. The exact amount is genuinely difficult to calculate. That difficulty is not accidental. But Italy, remarkably, is not the most dramatic example. Germany is. Germany is widely regarded as Europe's model of fiscal discipline. Its official debt ratio of roughly 63% of GDP looks almost reasonable by regional standards. German politicians have historically lectured their southern neighbors about the importance of fiscal responsibility. The constitutional debt brake, which restricts government borrowing, is treated as almost sacred policy. German media presents the country as the Eurozone's anchor of stability. What German politicians do not advertise is that their country carries pension obligations, promises made to retirees and near retirees, that are not included in the official debt calculation. Because Eurostat rules classify public pension liabilities as implicit rather than explicit debt, they can legally be omitted from the headline number. Independent estimates of Germany's total implicit pension obligations range from 1.2 trillion to over 2 trillion euros, representing roughly 40 to 60% of additional annual GDP burden. depending on which demographic assumptions and discount rates are applied. Here is the core of the problem. Germany has a rapidly aging population. The ratio of working-age citizens supporting retirees is worsening every decade. The generation that built Germany's post-war economic miracle is retiring. The generation behind it is smaller. The pensions owed are enormous, and unlike government bonds, which at least appear on official ledgers and can be restructured through negotiation, pension obligations are political commitments that democracies find nearly impossible to reduce without triggering electoral collapse. Democracy decides who governs. Demographics decide who pays. France carries similar off-balance sheet obligations. Spain's combination of explicit debt and implicit pension commitments creates a picture considerably more alarming than the official bond market numbers suggest. And across the Eurozone, there is another hidden mechanism that almost nobody outside central banking circles discusses openly: the Target 2 imbalance system. Target 2 is the payment system that settles transactions between Eurozone member central banks. When a German bank sends money to an Italian bank, the transaction flows through Target 2. Under normal circumstances, these balances cancel out over time. But since the 2008 financial crisis, they haven't. Instead, capital has been steadily flowing from Southern European financial institutions toward Northern European banks, particularly the German Bundesbank, leaving a Target 2 claim exceeding 1 trillion euros that Germany technically holds against the broader ECB system. What this means, in practice, is that Germany has been effectively lending money to Southern European economies through a mechanism that appears in no government budget, passes through no parliamentary vote, and is invisible to the overwhelming majority of European citizens. If the Eurozone were to fracture, if Italy or another large southern member were to leave, those Target 2 claims could crystallize into real losses. Economists disagree sharply about the exact risk, but they agree on one thing: the claims exist, they are enormous, and they have grown in silence. The system has been designed, not through conspiracy but through incentive, to make the true scale of European obligations difficult for anyone outside the financial bureaucracy to fully assess. Now think about what this means for you. Every pension guarantee, every off-balance sheet commitment, every Target 2 imbalance ultimately represents a claim on future tax revenue, which means a claim on future labor. The workers entering European labor markets today are not just paying for current government services. They are paying for promises made to a generation that will retire before they reach their own middle age. The burden is structural. It was baked in by demographic choices made decades ago, amplified by accounting rules designed to allow governments to understate their true obligations, and sustained by a political culture that punishes honesty about long-term costs. This is not conspiracy. This is the logical outcome of incentives. Politicians face elections every 4 or 5 years. Pension obligations mature in 30 or 40 years. The political reward for acknowledging long-term unsustainability is small. The political cost of doing so is enormous, so the hidden debt grows. The implicit obligations expand. The demographic math gets worse, and every year that passes without structural reform makes the eventual adjustment more severe. History's lesson is unambiguous. The Venetian Monte Vecchio eventually collapsed into irrelevance as the Republic's commercial power faded. Philip II's Juros became worthless as Spain's silver empire contracted. France's pre-revolutionary debt, managed through royal loan instruments called rentes viagères, and sold by royal bankers who concealed the true scale of the crown's obligations, helped trigger a fiscal crisis so severe that it contributed directly to the conditions of the French Revolution. When Louis XVI's finance ministers finally attempted to reveal the full scope of royal debt in the 1780s, the shock to creditors and the public was profound. The gap between what citizens believed was owed and what was actually owed proved more politically explosive than the debt itself. Every society that has delayed acknowledging its true debt burden has eventually paid a price that exceeded what honest acknowledgement would have cost years earlier. So what should you take from this? First, understand that official debt numbers are not lies. They are legal categories. When a European government reports its debt at 60 or 100 or 140% of GDP, it is reporting the figure that Eurostat accounting rules require it to report. The implicit obligations, pensions, off-balance sheet guarantees, derivative contracts, Target 2 claims, are not hidden through criminal intent. They are hidden through definitions. Learning to read beyond the headline is not paranoia. It is the beginning of real financial literacy. Second, watch demographics, not just debt ratios. The European crisis is not primarily a borrowing problem, it is a demographic one. Countries with aging populations and shrinking workforces face structurally rising obligations against a narrowing revenue base. This dynamic does not resolve through economic growth alone. It requires either higher taxes, reduced benefits, more immigration, or some combination of all three, none of which are politically comfortable. Governments that pretend otherwise are buying political time at the cost of mathematical reality. Third, recognize that the real risk is not a dramatic default. European governments are not going to suddenly refuse to pay their bonds in the way Argentina or Sri Lanka has. The real risk is what they will do to avoid default. Inflate obligations away, reduce pension values through indexation changes, extend retirement ages, quietly shift burdens to working generations through tax increases disguised as something else. The debt will be paid, but the payment may not look like what anyone expects, and those least prepared to absorb it will absorb it most. The hidden debt of Europe is not a secret kept by shadowy figures in dark rooms. It is a secret kept in plain sight, encoded in accounting definitions, obscured by complexity, and sustained by a collective political unwillingness to say plainly what the numbers, honestly assembled, would show. Financial education is not just useful knowledge. In a world where governments are structurally incentivized to obscure their true obligations, understanding how debt is measured and how it can be hidden is a form of self-defense that most people never learn they need. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. This is untold financial history. I'll show you where to look,